Welcome, welcome everyone. I am so excited to have you on We Earth Radio, and my guest today is noted neuropsychiatrist and New York Times bestselling author Daniel J. Siegel, MD. He is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine, executive director of the Mindsight Institute in LA, and a world-renowned and conference speaker. He is founding editor of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, and his newest book, Intraconnected, MUI, where me plus we equals MUI, as the integration of self, identity, and belonging. Dan, it's so good to have you on again. Welcome.
Michael, it's great to be here with you. Great to see you. Great to be connected around all these important issues.
This is a very important issue. Of all the issues in the world, I believe that this journey from separate self to intra or integrated self with everyone else, which we're going to talk about. I thought before we started, maybe you could tell people what interpersonal neurobiology is, though, because some people go, what?
Sure, I know. Basically, it's a term I made up for a field where we invite every way of knowing. Initially, it was just the different sciences, like from anthropology, studying culture, to sociology, studying groups, to psychology, studying mental processes like emotion and memory, to biology, including the field I'm in, medicine and neuroscience, genetics, things like that, chemistry, physics, and even math. And then it broadened to include, poetry, and our dear common friend, John O'Donohue, was a part of that. Looking at literature, music, dance, the arts, and then exploring contemplative wisdom and also indigenous teachings. So here I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Tongva and the Chumash. And when you look at not only their teachings, but broadly indigenous teachings, it really is about how to see the self as much bigger than just your individuality. And so, in interpersonal neurobiology, we say, there is a whole view of reality that every discipline may have a very particular way of studying, but that we want each of them to come in and contribute to the vision of the whole. And we use a process called consilience, a term E.O. Wilson brought back from the 1800s. And consilience means, is there a common ground that has been discovered independently by different pursuits, and then we can build on that consilient common ground to create a framework for understanding the world and things like the mind and consciousness and reality. And that's what interpersonal neurobiology is a consilient approach that brings in all these different ways of knowing.
Consilient sounds like a forerunner to systems thinking, actually, the way you describe it, the idea.
It can be used in systems thinking, and certainly, for people who are linear thinkers, that is thinking A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, and not that D is influencing C and B and A also. Consilience helps because you can see in our world, our universe, our reality, that something called emergence happens. That is, something arises, like the wetness of water is not in any single water molecule, but taken together, the interaction of elements of a system gives rise to something, like the shape of clouds, for example, and that's called emergence. It's a kind of synergy. And absolutely, when you look at the consilience across, indigenous teachings have been really systems teachings for thousands of years before we knew the mathematics of systems in the 1980s that were kind of figured out. And that would be a good example, exactly so, of consilience.
Yeah. So let's talk about the solo self, the lie, the dangers, the impact of this idea of individualism or the skin. I love Alan Watts had this term, the skin encapsulated ego, which I think of sometimes when you say solo self.
Yeah, absolutely. Some interpretations of the word ego would be just like that, this notion of individuality being the sole source of identity. And then your belonging is only to people who are similar to you or related to you or look like you or believe things like you. And that view of let's just call it a solo self, I think contemplative teachings have taught be very wary of that, because it can send you down a road of living with a lot of despair. Indigenous teachings have taught that we are not only a part of one another and community, but we are a part of nature. But somehow modern culture, perhaps initially derived from the West, but now distributed all over the world. So I don't use the word Western except to talk historically about it, but we can use the word modern. This modern view is called individualism. And we have a very individualistic culture that believes that the self is embedded in only your body. And this view, while in the United States of America, for example, we may say, well, of course that's true. Who you are is here. I point to my body and I say, this is me. But if we look at the notion of self and say, well, wait a second, is the fundamental nature of self, which we can talk about in a moment, only inside your skin encapsulated body? Or is it something maybe a bit bigger than that and not confined to just the individual? So this is what set the journey for me to just look into some of these things. And it's what led to this word we, because we don't need to go all the way from individualism to what's called collectivism, where the individual disappears as a anonymous being in the we of relationality. But the me plus the we implies something that we don't really have a name for, but that you can be both inner within the body and inter in relationship to people on the planet. So that's where the notion of we comes from. And I can tell you where intra-connected comes from, but it's a story I'll tell. But that's basically the idea of, the solo self may be not only pervasive now in modern culture, but it looks like you could show, and I try to show this in the book, that it is the source, at least a contributing source, maybe even the cause of how we have, in a difficult way, handled the COVID-19 pandemic. It can be seen as the source of racism and social injustice. It can be seen as the source of misinformation and polarization. Clearly, it's the source of loneliness. And these are all pandemics. And another pandemic is climate change. And just listening to the news this morning before getting on with you, I was so filled with sadness about the meeting that's about to happen and how unlikely it is that modern countries, embracing this individuality, are going to see the greater good of really trying to work collaboratively to reduce carbon emissions. So, I know we can do something by examining, I think, kind of the splinter in our limping humanity on Earth and remove that splinter. I think the splinter is the modern construction of the solo self. And we have time to really have cultural evolution take on a fundamental shift, like looking at what the self is and redefining it. So we don't lose the individual nature of who we are. We actually expand that to include the relational nature.
And would you distinguish between individuation and individualism?
Yeah, well,
that's part of the start of the journey that you take us on in your book.
Yeah, exactly. And the book does do kind of a lifespan journey for the reader to say, here's a way of understanding how the self emerges and how then it's shaped by messages from your parents and other family members, how it's shaped in your experience in school and then in your job and then out in society. So you see, number one, that this term self can be looked at really in a disciplined way. So I review a bunch of ways of looking at self, but then come up with something very grounding in a consilient way across all those perspectives. And that's the acronym SPA. So when we say the word self, what we mean is that it's a subjective sensation, this primary feeling of being alive. That's the S of SPA. The P is the perspective, taking the point of view from that center of experience we're calling self, and then agency, acting on behalf of some center of experience. So experience is the flow of energy and information, And so it has a sensory component, and it has a feeling to it. It has a perspective to it, how it experiences a perception of the world, its frame of reference, and you can act on behalf of it. So that's spa. So then once you do that, you say, well, then the solo self can be constructed to be narrow. So in terms of your question about individuation and the individual and individualism, those all point to the self being centered in the body. And, for a little child, that's fine. You need to know you have a body. You have what's called a core self that I review in the book of, the emotions you feel and the agency you have and the continuity you have in this body and the coherence. You make sense of life, and that's all really, really important. And at the same time, you're not just an individual, you are part of a relational self. Literally, there's a subjective sense of the connectivity that you have with other people, initially in your family, and then with all people, and then with nature. There's a perspective you can take, seeing from the frame of reference of the not only other people, but the relationship you have with other people and with nature. And then there's agency, acting on behalf of the greater good, And so what I do is talk about an identity lens and say, yeah, sure, individuation is important, but that's not the same as individualistic cultures. It's very different. And, in my own field of mental health, sadly, we focused on the self as the synonym for individual. And then what happens because of that is we talk about self-actualization and self-understanding and self, realization and self, all this stuff. But when the self in those terms is defined as just the individual, you can see that we haven't done much good helping people feel more meaning and, magic and connection and happiness in their lives. We actually have not done well that way. So we may have certain techniques that can work for certain issues, but I think part of the problem is this solo self has been not only inaccurate, that is, that subjectivity, perspective, and agency are only in the body. That's inaccurate, but it's also, when it's told to you by others in authority, like your parents or your teachers or, the society in general, then it's a lie you're being told. And then when you look at this, it causing these pandemics that are killing people and killing nature, then, not to get extreme about it, but you can say the solo self-construction of modern culture is a lethal lie. So then once that became clear, I started feeling like, wow, what are the words we can use so that we don't freak people out and say, oh, get rid of the self, because there's a self actually hearing someone say that. And they say, no, I am a self. So this is not about getting rid of the self. It's about expanding the self with an experience of awe, with gratitude, with compassion, what are traditionally known as self-transcendent emotions. But I'm working with researchers like Dacher Keltner to change the name of that and instead call it self-expanding emotions. And it's not that you expand your ego and become more egotistical, just the opposite. It's you realize who you are is not just the individual in the body. You are the relationships with people and with all of nature.
Well, language is such an important part. This whole impact of language on the mental constructs that create that kind of rigidity of the solo self. And you talk about the shifting from the nouns to the verbs and how that can release the confinement of our thinking and our relating.
Exactly.
On that?
Yeah, it's exactly like you're saying, Michael. The way to think about it is, the human mind has categories for how it divides up the world. And on top of those categories, we construct concepts, beliefs about how the world is made up. And then when we take those categories and concepts and try to really pin them down, we create linguistic symbols called words. And then we share them with ourselves in journals or books, or we talk to each other like we're doing right now. So it's all good, categories, concepts, words, it's all beautiful. However, we need to be very careful, because when we start listening to ourselves, then we reinforce the beliefs, the concepts based on what we hear, and that, rigidifies in a way the categories. So if those words are primarily nouns, as they are in modern languages, then we see everything as an entity that is, I'm there and I'm here, you're there, and we're separate from each other. But instead, in indigenous languages, often like the Potawatomi in what we call North America, you have more verbs than nouns. And when you start languaging in verbing ways, I'm trying to do it even just with the ing, then what you start experiencing is a very different fluidity of reality, and the feeling of selfing, if we're going to make up a word like that, becomes something where you say, of course, selfing doesn't just happen because it's energy flow, and skull nor skin are barriers that block the flow of energy and information. They're just fluidly happening within, sure, and between, yes, in a verbing, selfing, emergent kind of way. And so I begin the book just with an invitation to the reader to say, let's be careful, because we're going to use nouns to talk to each other in this book, but it's really going to be a part of our job collectively as writer and reader to really look at these things. And when I did the reading for the audiobook, the audio engineer got into such an altered state of he couldn't do his engineering. We had to pause, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I don't know. I mean, I'm listening to your words, and my sense of self is expanding. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening." I said, "Well, okay, that's great to hear. And you're in the role of audio engineer now, not just listener to the book. So let me explain to you what the book is about and why that may be happening. That's cool that it's happening, and that's all a good thing. But you need to be careful, because engineers have to do a certain, technological role in that creation of an audiobook." But it was an interesting experience, I got to say, because when you begin to feel into the verb-like nature of self, it does have this expansive quality. And even if you think about the experience of awe, awe is defined as this experience where you're initially overwhelmed by something. You don't know how to make sense of it. It's a shift in something. You feel a feeling of awe, and then it's accompanied by this sense of expansion of, whoa, my perception the way it used to be was narrow. Now it's expanding. Even my subjective experience is expanding. And studies of awe even show the agency part of self. You start acting in more compassionate, altruistic ways. So it's kind of an amazing thing. I don't know what's going to happen when people read the book. The book's, going to be a journey for every reader. But I'm really fascinated to see if the invitation to reflect on self as verb, and therefore a natural invitation to realize that its location is not constricted by the skull or the skin. That just opens up an identity lens to really, like a camera, to really just widen what you're focused on. And sometimes you need to narrow it down, and enjoy the body, feed the body, stretch the body. If there's something going on with the body, take care of the body. So no one is in this journey. No, I'm not saying, and from a scientific point, I'm not saying it's a good idea. That is, we're not getting rid of the self. We're recognizing there's an inner self and an inter self, and the intra-connected term, came from, I was working with some system scientists, and we did a retreat up in Colorado. 3 days of the retreat were days spent alone in the forest. When we came out of the forest, we were trying to share with each other what the experience was like, and very similar. People felt interconnected, interdependent. They used Thich Nhat Hanh's beautiful term, interbeing. And then it came time for me to speak, and I'm, very careful about words. And I said, I resonate with what you're all saying. And at the same time, my experience was, after a few hours, there was the trees that I was, the creek that I was, the body called Dan that I was, the sand, the rocks. I was it all. So there was no more inter. I don't even know what to call it. I said, I guess it's intra. It was within the wholeness of it all. I was intraconnected. And they go, oh yeah, that's intraconnected. And when I got back to my computer after we came out of the forest to take some notes, every time I typed, yeah, I had this appearance of, I would call intraconnected. The word processor did autocorrect and changed it to interconnected. And I said, what's wrong with my computer? And I looked it up. There is no such word as intra-connected. And then I thought, wow, based on our conversation about language, I said, if we don't even in English at least have a word that talks about the perspective of the whole, then what's our belief and concept about it? And how do we actually see the whole as a category of looking at reality? And that's when I really got inspired to say, this needs to be a conversation, that we need to have with one another,
Yeah. Well, just looking at the prefix, inter means between, intra means within. So that notion of that. And
Yeah.
when you look at, say, a noun, we all know from third grade is a person, place, or thing, Mrs. Smith,
Exactly.
And so the only way you can know a person, place, or thing is from the past of what you already know. But a verb is an action that's happening and unfolding as we speak. So it's actually emergent. And I think when we pay attention to conversations and language that people use and hear them speak, you can see the difference between an emergent conversation with whatever is happening, feeling, sensing into the verb aspect is alive, and the noun aspect, that part of coming from the past, is non-emergent. So you can see there's a stuckness in there in that whole sense of self. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Beautifully said. Yeah.
Heidegger said that language is the house of being. So when we look at being, our right to be, that being is constricted by that language. And then, of course, there's belonging and becoming. All three of those aspects of our evolutionary self. I think that's a good opening for you to bring in the piece on belonging, but I'm also interested in the tension between belonging and becoming, because there is a tension there.
Yeah. And I'm trying to quote John O'Donohue here with his beautiful poem, Fluent. But I'm going to get the end wrong. It's something like, and we can look it up. I'd like to live like a river flows.
Surprised by my own unfolding.
Surprised by its own unfolding. Yeah, exactly. There you go. That's a beautiful way of joining our minds, Michael. So yeah, becoming and belonging. I mean, that's exactly it, is that these verbs, and I know John has his beautiful book, To Bless the Space Between Us, which I think would resonate with this notion, of the idea of intraconnectedness, the becoming. So if we have a noun-like fixed category, like I am this way, and a concept, who you are is this fixed nature of existence, you are an entity, and there's certainty in entity as identity, and certainty gives us an illusion of safety, right? And the artist Rashid in the entry to the Brooklyn Public Library has this beautiful quote, something like, having discovered the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. So in that beautiful quote from her, we have the essence of this notion that becoming, when it's free, and becoming free in many ways, is dropping out of the noun-like rigidification of, an entity identity for certainty, when it's a flimsy fantasy of certainty. And you realize that's a kind of a trapping oneself in a prison of personhood, personality. Identifying the solo self would be one example in modern culture that gives you an illusion, well, this is solid, I'm this certainty in my identity as an entity, and that's a noun. I am Dan, you are Michael. That's it, you know. And so that flimsy fantasy of certainty drives a whole cascade of ways of living that are in a way defensive against the reality of uncertainty. And even when you look at the nature of energy, energy in quantum physics terms is considered the movement from possibility to actuality. And so it's full of emergence, it's full of things arising, it's full of probabilities rather than certainties. And so when you start to live like a river flows, you know, you are surprised by your own unfolding. And as you emerge, then you can say, well, then where are you? Well, that's exactly it. You are in many places. If the you is the spa, the subjective experience, perspective, and agency, and you open that up to becoming free, then, you know, then it is like this verb-like unfolding. Now, you're asking to relate becoming in that verb-like way to belonging. And if in your verb-like unfolding as a becoming emergent experience of selfing, you know, that is both inner and inter, you come up with, you know, people who believe in the noun-like experience of things and say, hey, people with my color hair are good and people with your color hair are bad, you know, then it's going to feel like not belonging because you are not belonging to that person or that group of people with that color hair. So what the invitation in the book is to say, you know, beneath all that emergence is this process of linking. And that when we link and say we embrace people of all color hair, we embrace species of all kinds of origins, animals, fungi, plants, we, you know, are here to embrace linking. And then when you realize the process of linking, while we can see it from a scientific point of view, it's really the experience of love. And then you go, whoa. And, you know, you know, I was able before the pandemic, the viral pandemic, you know, was able to do this wheel of awareness practice with 50,000 people in person, 50,000, not all at once, but, you know, over many workshops. And when they would get in the center of this wheel and drop into pure awareness. So the hub of the wheel, the center, is the experience of knowing or being aware. The rim is a metaphor for representing the things that are known, like what you hear or see or smell, or what you feel in your body, or your thoughts, your memories, your emotions, or even your relational sense of connection. But all those are knowns on the rim, and you can move a singular spoke around. Well, part of the practice in the workshops we would do is to bend the spoke around into the hub itself, or just retract the spoke, or just leave the spoke in the hub, or just have no spoke and just rest in the hub, all the same notion. How can I just be in pure awareness? And even people who've never meditated before, even people who didn't want to be in the workshops and their spouses dragged them there, even people who were like in parliaments where it was just a part of the parliament requirement that they're going to spend a day with me, and I did the wheel of awareness, they would experience in the hub so commonly love, connection. As one parliamentarian said to me once, I've never felt so connected to everyone and everything in my life. And then he was crying because I was so filled with love, and he wouldn't share it with his colleagues. I said, why wouldn't you share it? He goes, they would think I was weak if I talked about love.
And that's the tension that I'm talking about, is that if I'm becoming, I'm expanding, I'm growing, and I'm in a group or in a relationship, that's a threat to my belonging in that group and that relationship. So I think that's really important what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And if that love, that I think it's like a universal thread of the tapestry of reality, actually, love and linkage and connection, this awareness, you know, all this stuff. So when you drop into that, you start getting filled with love. It's just remarkable, actually. And this isn't like, as a scientist, I was kind of just curious to see what happens if you do this wheel of awareness where you're integrating consciousness, basically differentiating its components and linking them. I never had an expectation, zero, that people would get in the hub and say, oh, oh my God, I'm connected to everything and filled with love over and over and over and over again. So as a scientist, just purely as a scientist, I can only say I've collected research data, and this is what the data says. In pure awareness, people feel linkage, that's connection, and love. That's what they're saying. Now you can say, well, how do you know they felt love? I can just tell you, it's what they say. What more can I say about it? Well, did you do a brain scan? Well, this isn't about brain scan. I mean, I'd love to do a brain scan. That'd be cool. What we know about love and the brain is it's hugely integrated. The brain becomes really receptive and open and very integrated. That's, what's called universal compassion. But, so I imagine if you did the study in that hub, that's what you'd find. But independent, whatever the brain might find, the subjective experience of people in that open state is love. That's the S of spa. The perspective they take is they start seeing from other people's points of view and the point of view of nature. This is what people talk about. And the agency is they start literally acting on behalf of the greater good. So because the world is them. It's not like, oh, I want to impress people and like show you I'm altruistic. No, it's like if you stub your foot, you take care of your toe, right? Because it's you. So if you becomes this verb like more broad experience that you are people and you are nature, then it's pretty natural to take care of our world. And this is why, the solo self view is a lethal lie, because it's and I talk about this in brain terms in the book, but, when you construct from what you're told that a view that the self is separate, then you categorize there's self versus other. And then if that self is a solo self, then unfortunately, we've had probably 50 million years of primate history where we have in-group, out-group distinction, and we protect our in-group, and we are hostile. The best we're neutral, but otherwise we're hostile, sometimes killing in terms of genocide, people we put in the out-group, we dehumanize them. So this history of in-group, out-group distinction means that when you construct a solo self, it makes humanity vulnerable to destroying itself. Itself meaning other humans, and itself literally meaning all of nature. And, even in the last 50 years, this is a sad thing to say, but it's worth just stating it. And although people feel it, we've lost over 2/3 of the species that existed. Michael, when you and I were kids, they're gone. They're gone. I went to do some tide pooling with, the other day where I used to always go as a kid. The tide pools were empty. When I was a kid, they were teeming with life. I walked around there. I said, well, I don't mind my feet being wet. That's kind of fun. But where are my fellow beings? Where are we? Where did we go? And it was really sad. There's a Glenn Albrecht is a philosopher down in Western Australia who has this powerful and painful term called solastalgia, a longing for the world that used to exist, that even if we weren't alive back then, we know it used to exist. And it's the sadness. And Joanna Macy beautifully talks about that to connect with each other and with nature, we need to go through a grieving process and not ignore that. So anyway, I don't want to make this a downer, but the positive thing about this is, if the mind in modern culture has in fact constructed a solo self that is in fact the cause of these pandemics, including climate change issues and racism and social injustice, while that's sad to know we've created it, the good news about that is if the mind created it, the mind can actually change from business as usual and go in a different direction. Joanna Macy calls this the great turning. And in the book, there's kind of a message of here's how we can actually cultivate the conditions making the great turning more likely to happen. And it begins with, as Joanna says, quantum change, which is what I talk about in the book, of, who we are, what our identity is.
Yeah, I just want to say for a second, first of all, that the Wheel of Awareness practice, there's a section in the back of your book. And
yeah.
Again, the book is intraconnected, just put a plug in for it. And And I'm talking to Dr. Dan Siegel about this new book called Intra-Connected. And I wanted to go back a little bit when we were talking about uncertainty, because I was feeling not quite, there's a whole nother piece there that I think is important to bring in, that in that quest for certainty is also the quest for control. And that's such a huge issue that keeps us from being emergent and being in a place where we can actually connect and feel each other. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this journey into uncertainty and how that can actually support us in breaking through the barriers, the prison of our own self-imposed identity.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly like you're saying, Michael. That flimsy fancy of certainty has with it that is, if I can predict, I can protect. So that, prediction is about somehow knowing with some kind of degree of certainty how to prepare for things that might happen. So I'm going to be safe, basically. So it's one of the core motivations we have, is for safety through certainty. Now, how do you attain that? You attain that through control, and then you can say, well, then someone's like a control freak or something like that. Well, we don't have to use a pejorative term like that and insult people. We can just say life is hard and life is uncertain, and yet you get a feeling of safety when you have certainty. So what are you supposed to do? Well, I guess you try to control your environment. You try to control other people. You try to control your own thoughts. You try to control your identity. Well, let me see if I'm controlling my identity. Oh yeah, I'll put my identity, my subjective experience, perspective, and agency, I'll put inside this body because at least I can control that. I can't control my partner. I can't control other family members. I can't control my community. I can't control the world. At least I can control this body. So it's exactly like you're saying that when you then put a lot of energy into control, it takes all sorts of different forms. But one is just this solo self view. So, part of, sadly, what happens when there's scarcity is you activate this drive for control and drive for division. Us versus them is intensified when there's scarcity. And this scarcity is basically part of a larger issue of threat. So when human beings feel threatened, they increase their in-group, out-group distinction and say, I can actually get a feeling of certainty because I know who's in my in-group. And if you're not in my in-group, boy, you better stay away from me because I can be pretty dehumanizing. I might even, kill you. Stay away. That unfortunately, that's what primates do. And we are primates, and human beings have been doing this for a long, long time. So it's not like that's new. What we need to do is override that, because we're doing that not only with other human beings that don't look like us or different nationalities or beliefs, but we're doing it with other species. So we're basically saying, hey, this earth, it's like one big trash can. Let me make a bunch of toys and distract myself from this meaningless life of separation I have, and who cares if I pollute the world, because I'm going to have my toys behind my fence, and that's kind of, it may sound simplistic, but it's kind of what we're doing. And so the mental experience beneath it is exactly what you're saying. If I can get like 20,000 toys, I'm going to control the number of toys I have. Whoa, I'm not really happy. Maybe I'll get 40,000 toys. Now I need 100,000 toys. Whoops, I'm still not happy. I need 1,000,000 toys, or whatever the equivalent is, dollars or whatever, So it's kind of this endless, what's sometimes called the hedonic treadmill, this endless loop of running, when in fact, the core problem is that the self is being defined as separate. So the feeling of a larger love, of belonging, of becoming, of embracing uncertainty, and not being driven to control all the time, all those things are being blocked because the fundamental category of self versus other and the belief, oh, I need to just do something with this self, like accumulate stuff, dominates a person's life. but it never is satisfying. I know, I mean, I can tell you this not just from research, but as a therapist, when people are in the quiet of a therapy office, no matter how accomplished they are financially, if their life is not full of connection and love, it's a very desperate life they're leading, full of suffering, full of chaos, full of rigidity, no matter what people may think on the outside. So, so this as a therapist has taught me, but knowing the research has also taught me, and then exploring this in the Interconnected book, it's really about dropping out of that illusion of control, letting go of that flimsy fantasy of certainty, embracing the reality of uncertainty. And guess what? You know what happens from there is you realize the synonym for uncertainty is freedom and possibility.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Dan, you didn't really address it directly in Interconnected, your new book, but I think we'd be remiss to not talk about a little bit about trauma, which is very much in the consciousness of many people right now, and the impact. When we talk about trauma, we're the two main things that come out of being traumatized are separation and scarcity, which we just talked about. Those are two of the key things that happen. And also the shutting down of our ability to read other people too. So, I'm over here in Northern California, you're down there in Southern California. In a sense, there's a separation, but as we connect and share together, you're showing up in my nervous system and I'm showing up in yours. So in a very real way, there's no separation, even with being, 1,000 miles, 800 miles apart. But if I'm dealing with the adaptation of trauma, because trauma isn't, we think of trauma as the thing that happened. I'm sure you agree that it's what happens in us when we have a trauma that continues to live, that frozen, fragmented parts. So when we're looking at trying to widen the lens from the solo self to the intraconnected self, how do we begin to work with the individual, the familial, the collective, and the ancestral trauma that is always here in us? It's in our bodies.
Yeah, well, I mean, that work is exactly the work of embracing uncertainty that you brought up earlier, I think, and in other writings, when I talk about trauma, it's very specific to saying, well, if the individual had a particular experience, let's say, of abuse or neglect, the journey towards healing is a journey that, we get into quite deeply, called integration. And integration is where you're, differentiating and linking aspects of memory, of emotion as an integrative process, building that memory journey, and narrative making sense. There's all sorts of ways of talking about it. In Interconnected, in a way, the whole book is about collective trauma. It's about the trauma of being told a lie. And there's a section in the book when I talk about epistemic trust, whether what you're being told from authority figures or your parents or society in general, is true. And so in many ways, the solo self lessons that we learn in modern culture is a violation to epistemic trust. And so we are constantly trying to live this life of trauma, like you're saying. And I think it's a really excellent point that scarcity and separation start arising with trauma, and we start feeling like we don't have the resources. So the real double trouble with that is, of course, you're both traumatized from society, and then if you're traumatized literally individually in your family, then, where do you turn with all that? And I think that's why people are in such a hard place. So in some ways, the journey towards healing, which is a journey of integration, is embraced. If you look at the second appendix in the book, it's this sequence of movements that are all about the domains of integration, 9 domains. And each of those would be ways for individual trauma, but also for collective trauma, that we would find a way towards integrative growth, which is, I think, the base of healing trauma. But I think it's an excellent point. And, I think, there's the next book I'm writing with some colleagues is about kind of the deep mechanisms of personality that may arise from temperament. I touch on them briefly in the Interconnected book. And that so each of us may have our unique way of dealing with our personal trauma, but also the planetary trauma can arise in, broadly with 3 kind of vectors or directionalities. One is about the need for agency that can really give rise to a lot of anger if it's frustrated. Another is a need for bonding that can give rise to a lot of sadness or separation distress. And a third is this motivation for certainty, which can, looking for safety, which can give rise to a lot of fear. So those are the big 3 people often talk about: anger, sadness, and fear. And so trauma, like you're describing, Michael, may emerge in a person's life where they become very angry. And another person experiencing similar conditions, their way of going may be sad. Other people may be terrified. So I touch on that briefly, and then I'll have an entire book or books coming up, looking at that, especially when you weave this with attachment. Then you have some really, really powerful ways of saying, yes, we're facing very overwhelming conditions you could certainly call trauma and traumatizing. And each of us may have a temperamental proclivity, to have this predisposition of our nervous systems, maybe highlighting one of these vectors: sadness, anger, fear. And then understanding that and realizing, the drive for agency or the drive for bonding or the drive for certainty, may have different potencies in us. And that doesn't mean we're not all experiencing trauma. It just means we may actually internally experience it and then express it in quite distinct ways. So there are lots of layers to how to address your question. And, and there'll be an entire book coming
I look forward to that.
On that.
It's just another aspect, not necessarily just the trauma part, but, I came out of the corporate world where I used to say I work with heads on sticks. They don't only have bodies to carry their head to the next meeting, right? And I was fortunate to spend almost 4 decades with Gabrielle Roth, that I more in my body as a student and a teacher, and brought that into the corporate world. But people are more than ever, I think, disembodied and unable to connect with their emotions. Yeah. And so, this, you mentioned movement. That's what triggered this in that section. And, to really have conscious movement. I mean, Gabrielle's 5 rhythms was an incredible gift. They're really different maps of consciousness and evolution and all kinds of things. But to be able to rehabilitate our ability to feel our body and to feel our emotions in the body, not in the head, but to feel them in the body, I think is a crucial aspect of our ability to step out of the solo self and broaden the lens. And I'm wondering your thoughts about the somatic and emotional aspects, the rehabilitation need there.
Yeah, totally. Well, you must have been happy when you saw me quoting Gabrielle Roth in the book.
I did.
Yeah, and it was fun to put.
And Joanna Macy, who was one of my favorite teachers too.
Yeah. So I love quoting her, and the book. I forgot the name of it, but it was beautiful. I think the book has went through so many transformations. I think the quote of hers is right next to one of Gregory Bateson, who talks about not only patterns but meta patterns, patterns of patterns, and feeling into these patterns, really allows you to dance into the verb-like nature of existence, of experience, of life, of love. And so I myself also was very influenced by modern dance. I never had the opportunity, unfortunately, to study with Gabriel Roth, but I would love to try that. And so for me, what you're saying about the somatic part of it is essential. And what's interesting about that from our discussion from before with your question of control is, especially if you look at the cortical areas, the higher part of the cortex, especially in the left side of the brain, there is an attempt to map out how things should be and a lot of expectations. And it's quite different from, dropping into the sensations of the body. And then another way of thinking about it, and I talk about this in the beginning of the book, is there's a midline area called the default mode network in the cortex that is mostly midline. But the key thing about this with what your question is, it is very active when we're worried about stuff. It's also a part of the narrative self. And if we construct a noun-like narrative that's preoccupied with itself, it actually is mutually inhibitory. That is, when it's active, you're not really feeling the body. But when you go to sensations, it's more on the side or lateral circuits that allow you to feel the interior of the body or movement. So sensation is on the side, preoccupation is in the middle, and these are mutually inhibitory. So the beautiful thing about the neurobiology insights are that when you move in dance, or when you just open to the sensation of the body, you automatically have this narratively constructed solo self begin to relax. And you can't control what your body is feeling. You can try to control bodily movement, but even in that, there's an emergent process of, dancing with someone else or dancing with the music or, finding yourself, working with gravity, that it is not possible to control everything. Even walking is a funny thing because, it's literally a process of leaning forward and falling and then catching yourself with the other leg. It's a really goofy thing. I was watching my dog this morning in the park up in the mountains walk, and she's got 4 legs, so she's never really falling. She's just kind of trotting along in her beautiful little way. And but me on 2 legs, it's a falling process. You're always out of control, like, whoa, boom, boom, boom. So I think the body is this incredible source of not only embracing uncertainty, but of wisdom, that we have likely ways in which the gut and the heart especially, but even our muscle experience, give us signals that are a deep source of intuition. It doesn't mean it's always right, but it means we should always be at least listening into the body and opening up. Even if we can't control what the body's going to feel, we can open to what the body's signals are telling us.
We're getting close to the end of our time, and I'm just, so I could easily spend a few more hours talking with you, Dan. But I'm thinking of, our structures, much because of this solo self, are falling apart. Our economic structures, our environmental structures, our educational, there's a lot of chaos and dissolution that's happening and will continue to happen. And I'm wondering, I often say that the currency of the future is community. And I'm really curious about how maybe some of the suggestions you have to not only dissolve, because it's easy to look at the separate self as being a leader, but what about leadership of the future in our communities when people are really in uncertainty and difficulty and challenges just with basic, and which is happening so many places in the world, just basic needs like food and shelter and that. How can we use this work that you've been doing on the intraconnection to put our attention on a larger context of how will I be a leader in my community and how will I support people? Because I like taking it out of the individual, because we're doing that in my community.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'll begin with a term I learned from Arthur Zions. It's an academic term, and people use it in different ways, but it's called pervasive leadership. And what that means is that every human being has the potential to take on a vision of how the world could be, embrace that, and within whatever their domain of their life is, influence certainly their own actions, and then and inspire one person next to them, two, you know. So pervasive leadership means everyone can take on these ideas and make that happen. Now, different people in terms of systems have different functions in a system. Some are working in their corner of a system, and they can make the plot of small plot of land there growing vegetables that they eat. Someone else may be in a larger nodal system to not only maybe organize a whole farm, but someone else might be in a position to work in government to really work for new kinds of farming that are regenerative. And Paul Hawking's great book Regeneration is can show you ways to do that. So every one of us, as they say in the Potawatomi Nation, Robin Wall Kimmerer says this in Braiding Sweetgrass, has a responsibility to cultivate our individual gifts and offer them for the greater good. So, my hope for the intraconnected conversation is that people realize that you begin to have the conversation even within your inner self, that, wow, I'm a verb, not a noun, and I can actually open up to being not just inside, but between. And when I embrace the two of them, it's the intraconnected nature of my we, even just something small like that. You start speaking with a neighbor about that, a friend, a colleague, soon a conversation turns into cultural change. And now, can we institute this in formal ways in companies? Yes. In governments? Yes. And, I'm working in that level too. But, for a given reader, I think the notion of pervasive leadership, which I bring up in the book, is really important because everyone should feel the empowerment that this cultural shift, it's not that it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility in whatever ways we can do, small and large, to really start considering this might be the splinter. We remove the splinter, and then we can walk through life in a much more regenerative, integrative, whole kind of way that I think is I think it's very possible. I think the book tries to say, we can do this. Now, the big question is, will we do this? So my deepest hope is that these conversations with youth, with adults, I have this with my 93-year-old mom, we can have this conversation and culture changes. As Margaret Mead said, don't ever believe that a small group of people cannot change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So even if it's just a small group of people that start this conversation out, we can do this. And I think we will.
Yeah, beautiful. Dan, such a delight. Again, your book, Interconnected, I highly recommend it. Is it out on the street yet?
It'll be out November 15th.
November 15th, coming right up. So
yeah,
just many thanks for all your work, and just so grateful for the time together. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor. Thank you for being here.